Good morning, everyone. This is Karen Criswell with ODOT, with the Rail and Transit Division. I am the Statewide Transportation Improvement Fund Implementation Project Manager, and I'll be delivering the webinar this morning. We were going to be focused this morning on two things. Cancel. On two things. For the first part of the webinar, we'll be going through how to complete the STIF plan template, which is the way that you apply for formula funds. The webinar is primarily intended for the qualified entities that will need to complete the form. However, if your qualified entity is using the optional application that's intended for public transportation service providers to submit applications to the qualified entity, you'll find pieces of this relevant to you as well. Once we get through the plan template review piece, then we'll open it up for general Q&A related to the rules or any other questions you might have about STIF, and then we'll wrap up by 11 a.m. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Seth Baker, who's here with me from Enviro Issues, and frankly, the brains behind running the technology of this webinar. And then I also have Brian Roth with the transit section in the room. Brian is the builder and architect of this web template, and if I get stuck, he's going to help me.
Hi, everybody. This is Seth Baker, running the webinar today with Karen. I just want to give a reminder that all attendees are on mute right now. We do encourage you to ask questions by using the chat feature, which you will see on the right pane of the webinar towards the bottom. So please type your questions there, and we will pause periodically to read your questions and answer them, particularly questions of statewide relevance for other transportation providers around the state. If you have a specific question that is specific to your organization, you can contact your local regional transit coordinator or Karen Criswell after the webinar.
Oh, no, not me. Don't call me. No, I'm just kidding. Thanks, Seth. So as we're working through this, I'll encourage everyone, if you haven't already done it, to download and have at your fingertips the Formula Fund Guidance and Application Instructions document that's available on our website. And Part 2, application information, which starts on page 27, is the instructions for how to complete your applications. And so it's helpful to kind of follow along in there and make any notes in there. And I think with that, we are ready to go. So this online plan template is a fillable web-based form that uses a combination of checkboxes, yes or no questions, text boxes, and buttons for uploading documents and adding information. All questions are required to be answered unless specified as optional, and a failure to respond could result in an ODOT determining that the plan is incomplete and requiring resubmittal. Some yes or no questions, when checked, generate additional questions from a drop-down menu based on the response. And so it's very important for you to answer all questions as they generate additional choices. In addition, there's some areas where if you enter data in an earlier section, it will auto-populate or provide additional questions to be answered in later sections. We've tried to do that as much as possible to reduce the possibility of errors and to make the form as easy for folks to use as possible. So the form is accessible on the STIF section of the Public Transportation Funding Opportunities page. And on the first use, when you open it, the first thing that you should do is select the Save button that's located in the lower right-hand portion of the template, all the way at the very, very bottom, right there. So that's the very first thing that you want to do. So whatever you do after that will be saved when you come back, and then you hit save again before you exit. When you're all complete, and I know this is jumping straight to the end, and you hit submit, a copy of the completed form will be emailed to you. And then when you hit save on the first time and you close the form, an email will be sent to you as well with a hyperlink to the form. So you'll be able to access it more quickly the next time. So the STIF plan application has 6 sections. There's the qualified entity information section, section 1. Section 2 is advisory committee information. Section 3 is local plan compliance. Section 4 is accountability. Section 5 is STIF plan adoption. And Section 6 is the media section, which is where you put in your various projects. All of the questions that are asked on this form are asked on here based on what is in the Oregon Administrative Rules that pertains to STIF Plan. So you'll see throughout the guidance document references to the OARs where you could go for additional information. Okay, so to get it started for the qualified entity, first box, this is a pre-populated drop-down menu with all of the relevant qualified entities listed here. So I'm going to pick Salem as a mass transit district just to get it started, which will help me later on. You enter your address, city, state, zip, your employer identification number, which is the 9-digit number assigned by the IRS to businesses operating in the U.S. It's sometimes known as a federal tax ID number. After that, enter the STIF plan contact name. So this is who we contact if we have questions about any of the content in your plan. Then we have a question about whether any of the projects will use funds that are jointly managed by one or more qualified entities. If you select yes, you will then have an opportunity to upload the documentation of your joint management agreement. So throughout the form, you will see the orange upload button. That is available in many sections where we've tried to give you the option of either entering a website URL where we can go and find that information, or you could enter the text information, or you could upload a document that contains the information. Generally, for us, if you can, text is preferred, or the website URL. Attached documents is kind of the lowest preference for us, but we'll accept it if that's what you have. The next piece is section 1.2, where the QE enters all of the public transportation service providers that will have projects as part of this STIF plan. And it is the same kind of contact information as the QE is required to enter. If you have multiple public transportation service providers, you just select the Add Provider orange box and continue on with adding your next provider. Then we get into section 2, advisory committees. So there's a couple of areas. Advisory committees is one, and accountability is another, where rather than us asking you to provide us with a lot of content, we've basically said, given you the option and said, check the box, and by checking the box, you're basically agreeing or certifying that you've met all of the requirements in the OARs. And then we have listed some of the specifics. So in this case, you check the box and then provide the website or other documentation that so we can go and verify whether these things are true. So for example, some of the things that we would be looking at is whether you have the 3 minimum constituencies represented on your advisory committee. Did you do public notification of your meetings? Did your advisory committee have an opportunity to review all the projects proposed by public transportation service providers? Do your bylaws include a definition of high percentage of low-income households? Those sorts of things. Okay, section 3, local plan compliance. So if you've been reading along and playing along with us previously, you already know that STIF Plan projects are required to be derived from approved, adopted local plans. So in Section 3, this is where you enter all of the local plans from which projects in your STIF Plan are derived. You enter this once so that when you get down to Section 6 and where you're entering your project, you have less data and information to enter there. So it's the local plan name of the governing body that adopted the plan adoption date, and the web address where we could find the plan. If you have multiple plans that you're referencing or pulling projects from, as with other sections, just select the Add a Local Plan box, and additional blanks will be open so you can continue to add local plans. 3.2 is where you indicate whether your local plan is consistent with the STIF requirements that are specified in the OARs. If you select no, and in this first cycle, if you are a qualified entity that is receiving only the minimal allocation, or you're a rural provider, and you have a coordinated plan, it is acceptable to not meet all of the local plan requirements. If you have a plan to bring your plan into compliance during this funding cycle, you can choose to use STIF funding to help you do that. And you could also include other projects within your STIF plan that would improve services. So if you select no, then what you need to enter into the box is which plan is non-compliant, in what way it's non-compliant, and your schedule for bringing it into compliance. Okay, now we get to the accountability section. I think the first thing I want to say about the accountability section, we've been getting a lot of questions about what exactly do components of this mean, even with looking at the guidance. One of the things that we've done, and I think at a very high level, the accountability requirements are very, very similar to what we already require for our other funding programs. We have, based on the volume of questions we have, we've stepped up our plans and our schedule to update our compliance manual, our compliance field guide, which specifies the questions that we'll be asking when we do our compliance reviews for STIF. I've already reviewed a first draft of that content, and we should have that finalized and available for providers sometime in September. So that will provide you with a lot more detail. At a very high level, and again, this section 4.1 is one of those sections where it's a checkbox rather than expecting you and asking you to prove up that you have all of these things in place. They are required to be in place, though, by the time, no later than the time of the OTC making a decision on STIF plan approval. Our preference, of course, is that they be in place earlier than that, as accountability is very important for STIF. So there's two pieces to this. The first piece is that the qualified entity is saying that they have all the policies and procedures in place necessary to achieve the goals and outcomes specified in the STIF plan. And then we've listed at a high level what those things are. If you look at our existing field book, you'll get an idea of the kinds of things that we're talking about here and what the requirements are. There's also some pretty good content in the guidance, STIF guidance document. That's on page 33 for those who want to read up more on it. Second piece in the second box is the way the legislature established STIF is the qualified entities are responsible for disbursement of local funds, but they're also responsible for providing oversight and monitoring for compliance of their public transportation service providers. Statute and rules give the qualified entity that authority. So the second box is about making sure the qualified entity is saying that they have the policies and procedures in place to ensure that their subrecipients will be compliant and achieve the goals and outcomes. Okay. Suballocation method, section 4.2. In this section, you're required to enter content that describes your method, the qualified entity's method for suballocating STIF Formula Fund monies, and also the collaborative process that was used to work with public transportation service providers and other potential subrecipients. So that could be, for example, a city that doesn't currently provide public transportation service, but might be interested in providing public transportation service, and therefore should be a party to that conversation as well and considered as part of the suballocation. So when we ask you to describe your suballocation method as well as the process, this is one area where we haven't asked you to provide to us necessarily evidence that you did these things, but that is something that we could come back and ask for. So whether it's, meeting agendas, minutes, emails that indicate that collaboration and consultation has occurred.
We do have a question when you're ready to pause.
Okay, and we're pausing for a question.
From Scott Chansey, do you have to have a suballocation method if there are no subrecipients?
No, you do not. So if you do not have any other public transportation service providers in your area, you would just simply describe that in this box.
And in section 4.1, if there are no did you just answer that?
Yeah.
If there are no subrecipients, do you still check the box?
Well, that is a good question. I think you would, how would we handle that, Brian? Ideas?
I think you'd still check the box.
Okay. So we're thinking you would still check the box, but then when you explain in 4.2 that you don't have any PTSPs, that would clarify that. But I think in the future we could change the form to add a third box that says not applicable, we have no public transportation service providers. So good question.
We've got a couple others rolling in.
Okay.
So if the subrecipient is a private nonprofit, would you put that under subrecipient even though they're considered contract service?
No. The only entities that can be subrecipients are public transportation service providers or potentially another qualified entity. If they're a nonprofit or a private operator, they are considered a contractor. And so the requirements are, and the oversight are slightly different.
What if there's only one provider in the qualified entities area?
I think we already addressed that.
And what evidence is necessary?
Of what?
That's what we have right now.
Evidence of collaboration, is that the question?
That could be it. Yes.
Yes. So some of the things that you would want to keep records of is if you have email invitations where you've invited folks to meetings, if you have meeting agendas, meeting minutes from the meetings, email exchanges or email notes from the meetings, those kinds of things. If, for example, you're a qualified entity and you've reached out to PTSPs and they're not interested in engaging, just having an email that shows that you've reached out is probably sufficient as well. And honestly, folks, this is probably one where we're still going through the process right now of developing the reviewer's checklist. ODOT staff, when these STIF plans come in, we have a responsibility to do a completeness check. It's all the required information there. And we're still sorting through exactly what level of review, what level of detail, and at what times we might go a little deeper to ask for more supporting information. And so this sub-allocation method is one of those ones that we're still having internal conversations about when we would look more deeply into that or not, because that definitely is an issue of legislative interest and of interest to a lot of providers around the state.
That's all we have right now.
Okay. So moving on to 4.3, high percentage of low-income households. Enter in text or upload explaining how the STIF plan defines and identifies communities with a high percentage of low-income households. So I think just want to mention here, it's important to remember that statute, or OARs, not statute, the OARs define low-income household. What is left for local discretion is how do you define communities that have a high percentage of low-income households. So make sure you include that high percentage piece as you're developing your definitions, and including that definition in your bylaws. So for example, here you could just pull the text out of your bylaws and put it in here as a probably easiest way to do that. Section 5, STIF plan period and adoption. So in this first cycle, the earliest possible start date for your STIF plan period, if you plan to start expending funds, and you've started expending funds as of January 1, 2018, against a plan that might be approved in the future, that is your earliest possible start date. If you're not, so your start date is when you would like to start expending against the STIF plan funds or the formula funds. If you're not planning to do anything until you get your first allocation, if you're submitting on the November 1 deadline, you could expect to start to receive funds by early May, so then you might want to put a May 1, 2019 start date. If you're submitting in May 1 of 2019, we are anticipating your plans would be approved in October, and then so November 1, 2019 would be your start date when your first funds would be dispersed. The end date for this first cycle is set to the end of the next biennium. In future fund cycles, you will have some flexibility to have 2-year plans or potentially 4-year plans.
We have a couple of questions when you're ready.
Okay.
Can you briefly describe a safe harbor definition for a high percentage of low income? I think meaning like a safe definition.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So what ODOT has said in guidance as a minimum is if the area is higher than the statewide average for low income. If you're a part of it, and I don't think I can just say here's a definition that works for everyone, because all of your circumstances are different. So if you're in a county where you have a pretty high percentage of the community is a low income community that meets the 200% of poverty definition, it's possible that you could say your entire county is a high percentage of low income because it's X percentage meets a poverty level.
And RTCs have received some training to help QEs with this definition.
Yes. So what I would suggest is if you're looking for help, we did have a training with all the RTCs last week on determining high percentage low income and the tools that are available, and they are stand ready to help you with that definition. We are also going to be having a training on that at the conference in October, so that's another place to get more assistance.
We have another question about communities. Are communities defined as cities, or could they be areas within cities or counties?
Yes. We intentionally, through the process, have not defined communities. There's local discretion on how you define communities.
Should we expect the May disbursement date to be a hard set date?
No. Based on the best information we have available right now, we believe we should be able to do the first disbursement within 2 to 3 weeks after OTC approval, but we don't know what we don't know. We know we need Legislative Fiscal Office approval to be able to do that first disbursement, and we've already been in contact with them, so we think that's a pretty reasonable expectation. Okay, good questions. Okay, STIF Plan adoption. So 5.2, this is where you enter the date that your advisory committee made a recommendation, and then the date that your governing body, your board of directors or whomever, adopted it. And then the website where the governing body adoption document is loaded. If that doesn't live on a website, you can just attach the documentation right here. And then, did the governing body modify the advisory committee's recommended plan? So advisory committees are just that, they're advisory to the governing body. The rules specify, though, that if the governing body makes a decision that's different from the advisory committee's recommendation, that they provide a rationale for that deviation and that they notify any affected public transportation service provider of that definition. So if the answer here is yes, the governing body made a different choice, then you explain the rationale for that deviation. Part of why we are asking this question ties to the legislative intent and expectation that qualified entities are dispersing the funds. And so this is one way to look at that dispersal as it relates to the governing body's decision making. Okay, now we're about to head into section 6, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the media section and probably the trickiest section for entering the data. So the way this section is organized, for each project, the plan must include the factors that are listed and required in the OARs. And it collects pretty detailed information about the projects and the public transportation service providers. So information collected for each project is the qualified entity name, public transportation service provider name if applicable, a project name and description, whether the project is part of your 100% list and the rank order on that list, or part of the QE's 130% list in the rank order. If you are a mass transit district or public transportation district, the percentage of the project budget that is allocated in and out of district, the percentage of budget shared to improve or expand a service versus maintain an existing service, local plan from which the project is derived, and then for multi-phase projects, timeline, total budget, other plan funding sources, and a description of the phase of work that's included in the STIF plan. So let's dive in a little bit of detail here. So for project 1, starting with project 1, if you're entering one of your own projects, you would just simply indicate your QE name here. If you're entering a project that is a public transportation service provider's project, you would enter their name here. Project name, limited to 50 characters. Project description. I can't recall the character limit on the project description box, but the expectation is that it's a really concise description. It might have elements such as the project location or extent, service span, frequency stops, customers, vehicles, equipment, other sorts of activities. But not a long narrative telling us how wonderful your project is. We know they're all wonderful projects. Okay, then the next piece is whether it's on your 100% list or 130%. You click on which list it's on, and then you indicate its ranking. Because we selected Salem Mass Transit at the very beginning, the form already knows to ask the question of the percentage of the project budget that's in district. And then you can make your selection from the drop down. Then you have the option of whether the budget share is to improve or expand or is to maintain an existing service. So whatever you select for improve, it will auto-populate the balance. If you're proposing a project, a percentage of which is to maintain an existing service, you have to explain the rationale for maintaining an existing service. This is an area that will be highly scrutinized by PTAC and by the OTC in their decision making. There are potentially some circumstances where maintaining an existing service is appropriate. If, for example, there were one-time funds, discretionary funds that went away, such as CMAQ, or if you had a pilot project that you wanted to continue, then that would be, say you were using discretionary funds from some other source and you wanted to continue that pilot project. That would be another example of a case that would make some sense. I lost my train of thought.
We have a couple questions when you're ready.
Okay. Let's go ahead and take the questions and I can, hopefully my brain will get back on track.
So another question related to nonprofits. Nonprofits can propose projects, but is it correct that they must be sponsored by the qualified entity, and that is who would submit the project?
So that is correct that nonprofits can't propose projects. They would need to partner with either a public transportation service provider or a qualified entity who would submit the project. And then if the STIF plan is approved, then that entity would do a procurement process to contract with the nonprofit to provide the service.
Could you please explain the percent of budget in district field more?
Yes. So let's say you have, it's similar to what you already do for STF, where the agency that's a district is required to explain percentage in district versus out of district. So let's say you're Salem-Kaiser and you have a route that serves a rural area outside of your district, and 50% of the line is listed physically within your district, and 50% is outside of your district. And if that's how the budget split is working, then that is how you would reflect that as 50%. And I think we have that sort of example elsewhere. I think TriMet and some other areas as well. But again, that question only pertains to areas where the QE is a transportation district or a mass transit district. Did that address your question?
That came from Paige West.
Okay.
Paige says yes.
Okay, thanks, Paige.
Are we expected to provide project descriptions for each bus line we are expanding, or do you want a description that says increased frequency on X bus lines, etc.?
Ooh, that's a fabulous question. So how projects are defined gives you great flexibility in how you enter your data, and I strongly encourage you to think strategically about that, to frankly minimize the number of projects that you're entering. So but you could choose to do it in different ways. So one way to look at it is you could have one project that is expanding hours of service operations on these bus lines, or district-wide, or what have you. Or you could choose to have, and then have a separate project that is a capital project that's buying vehicles. Or you could choose to do your projects organized, for example, by routes or geographic areas. And so under one project, you would have multiple tasks with different levels with different activity categories and activity details. And I'll get to that in a minute. But once you kind of see the intricacies of how this works, that can help you in how to package up your projects. And I think that's an area where RTCs can also help you to think that through. Because I think you want to take into consideration the other data that you'll be asked to supply with it. So your anticipated outcomes data, your anticipated, or the criteria percentages, which we'll get to in a minute.
For the drop-down field for the 100% and 130% lists, what if your project is contained in both 100% and 130% categories?
So let me, that is interesting. So project can only be on one list. So the 100% list, in April, we published allocation estimates. So what the agency is recommending, what ODOT's recommending, is that your 100% list should go up the total budget amount of that allocation estimate. We are currently expecting that there will be more revenue generated than what is on that allocation estimate from April, but we don't know how much more, new funding source. And so part of what we're encouraging and why we're doing this 130% list, providers, qualified entities could choose to submit lists that hit 100% of the allocation estimate. They could hit some other percentage over that. They could go to 150% if they wanted. This 30% is basically just a number that we put out as this seems like a reasonable number, and we realistically expect that revenue will come in somewhere between the 100% and the 130% level. So if you have a project and if you're doing a, one to the bottom of all of your project's prioritization, once you hit that allocation estimate amount, that's your 100% list. Anything below that then would be considered on the 130% list.
Last question for now. Is a procurement process required if a nonprofit is the only public transportation program under the qualified entity?
The answer is it depends on what your own procurement policies are. So this is not an area where, you really have to follow your own procurement policies. And so when we're at the point of doing compliance reviews, that's what we'll be looking at, to see that you have procurement policies in place and that you followed your own procurement policies.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, folks. I think the other thing that I want to mention right now in this area of maintaining an existing service or supplanting, one of the things that's going to be upcoming with conversation with the Public Transportation Advisory Committee at their September meeting is a discussion about conditions under which they may recommend rejection of a STIF plan, and proposing projects that would maintain existing services or supplanting of local transit funding is going to be one of those topics of conversation. And depending on PTAC's direction, we hope to be able to put out a document that provides greater description and greater detail of what those potential conditions under which a STIF plan could be rejected, to help give people more guidance. We're starting to get more and more questions in this area as well. So we'll just mention that right now. Okay, so then we're still at a project level of detail. So for this project, what is the local plan from which the project is derived? Recognizing that your project might be reflected in multiple plans, select the one plan that is the best representation of your project. So because of the data that you entered up above, you would just enter the local plan name and the page number or section that the plan is described. Is your project part of a larger multi-phase project? If you select yes, then this is the additional data that's needed. The overall project schedule from start to completion. So let's say, for example, you want to construct a new bus barn. And what you want to fund with this now is feasibility on several sites that you're looking at. So if your project is construct a bus barn, that's what you would enter at your project up above. Your timeline would be through construction, if you plan to keep coming back for more STIF funds to help with future phases. Your total project budget, so your overall estimate, other planned funding sources, and then what phase is represented in the current STIF plan. So you can see very faintly in the background an example. So this is phase 1 that is going to include multiple phases such as feasibility, site selection, site planning, permitting, construction. So that is one example. Part of the reason, well, okay, I think that's enough detail for that. This can also be used to say you have say you're going to do bonding for, you're purchasing a bunch of buses and you want to bond those. So that would be another example where this is, 20 years and we intend to continue to ask for STIF funds to repay for debt service on that bond. So that would be another example of how you might do that. So, excuse me, project scope. Okay, this is the part that I think it's particularly tricky. So the way we've organized this is we're using the FTA's activity line items, or ALIs, for the categories and the details that fall beneath this. So at the category level, and the reason for this with these successive drop-down menus is it's intended to give you as few of choices as possible as it relates to the higher levels. So, for example, you have 10 options at the category level. So let's say we're doing an operations project. What type of operations project? Is it a fixed route or demand response? Deviated fixed route projects should be categorized as fixed route as well. Okay, so that's the mode. Part of what this is going to help us to report is right now we have very poor understanding of the number of rides that are provided via demand response. And having this data will help us have a better understanding of how STIF is supporting both fixed route and demand response. What is the activity type? In this case, there's only one activity type, but then there's 3 different activity details. So operating, again, communication. So this is where you would put a project or a task that is marketing, or if it's mobility management, transit training, that is the category that you would select. So we're going to say operating assistance. So what we've got, so keeping in mind your levels of detail, so you have a project, but within your project, you can have multiple tasks. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio. So you could have an operations task. You could, once we get past all of this, you could come down and add more tasks. So you might have a capital task. So you might have operating tasks, operating detail, but then you might come back and have another task that's your marketing for the operations and so forth. So this is one, so say you've selected the wrong, well, I'm going to wait until I get into capital to show you how to undo wrong selections there. So then we get into expenditure estimates. There are 5 fund types listed. You cannot add fund types and you cannot delete fund types. So if something isn't relevant, you need to enter a 0. 0, hello, work with me, in that cell. It will show an error message otherwise. So for each, and it's for the year of expenditure, so the year that you plan on expending the funds. So federal funds are grouped together, other state funds, so this would be STF funding. It could be if you're planning on using, is this what we're doing, STIF discretionary as well as part of other state funds? I'm looking at Brian. You can't see me looking at Brian, but I'm looking at Brian. I think that's where that goes. Local funds and any other funds. So if you have private contributions, fairs, whatever, that would get entered in that category. So the add fund source box will get you nothing but an error message, so do not select it. I think there was a problem with the form where we couldn't make that go away, so that's there, just don't use it. Outcome measures. So for certain task types, operations tasks in particular, there are minimum required outcome measures or estimates that you're required to enter. Operations is the task type that has the minimums. The other task types, most of the other task types don't have those requirements except for capital where there's vehicles. But there are optional outcome measures and content and suggestions that we have in guidance for those measures. So for operations, entering, and when you look at guidance, there's quite a bit of information and suggestions for how to estimate or calculate some of these things if this is an area where you don't have that much experience, and this is another area where your RTCs can help you as well. So what is your estimated number of revenue miles in this project? Revenue hours, estimated number of rides. Access, number of people with access to transit, which is defined as within a half mile of a transit stop for fixed route. Number of low-income households with access to transit. And again, that's a half mile within a transit stop. Using Remix, if you have fixed route service, Remix has an option where you can select 200% of poverty, and it will populate that information for you. And I know just enough to be dangerous about this area, but your RTCs are great resources in this area. Number of new shared stops with other transit providers. So this is getting at one of the 7 areas of emphasis that the legislature had, which is reducing the fragmentation of transit service. And is the project supporting student transportation? And that's for grades 9 through 12. You'll recall that the statute requires qualified entities to spend at least 1% of their formula funds each year on improving student transportation to the extent practicable. So then we have a yes/no question. So we're going to say this one is no. What this helps with is later on in the summary tables, it will auto-populate the total dollar value that is for student transportation. And then there are optional outcome measures that could also be entered. These are not required.
We have some questions when you're ready.
Okay, questions. These are going to be hard questions, I can tell already. Go ahead, Seth.
One of these goes back a little bit, but for project lists, do you want a project list for each year if the project is going to grow within the first funding cycle, or do you want the 3 years of growth listed within one project?
The latter. So so you have your budget by year, but your performance measures are for the entire funding period. The other thing that I wanted to mention on is the service new, an expansion or a maintenance? If the service is new for the fund cycle in the first year, it's new for the entire fund cycle. So it doesn't flip to a maintenance project, for example, in the second year.
From Teresa Conley, this level of detail with subsets of each ALI may be new to providers. What opportunity is there to move funds between operating sub-ALIs once an STIF plan is approved? What flexibility is there to amend the STIF plan to move funds between ALIs?
Teresa, I'm going to remember this moment the next time I see you. I feel like you owe me a coffee or something like that. No, that's a great question. So there is no process for amending STIF plans. But keeping in mind that this formula fund, STIF formula funds, this is yet again so different from any funding funding that we currently have in place, providers have a lot more flexibility within an approved plan to move funds around. And so what we'll be looking at as we're reviewing quarterly reports and expenditures and outcomes is whether what you're doing is reasonably consistent with the approved plan. So, for example, say you think you need 4 buses of one particular size, but you get through additional analysis and you figure out, no, we actually need 2 larger buses, or we need 6 smaller buses. That's fine. That isn't anything that we would think is inconsistent with the plan. You're still buying buses, you're still extending service. You just report it on the other end. Teresa, does that sufficiently answer your question? Because I feel like there's a lot of very detailed possibilities and examples that will come up, and we'll have to just address those on a case-by-case basis as to whether it is still reasonably consistent with an approved STIF plan.
Teresa says it mostly answers her questions, and you guys can talk later.
While she's giving me coffee, preferably.
She says you can talk over coffee.
Okay.
For number of low-income households with access to transit, does this need to be consistent with the bylaws of the advisory committee formed for STIF, or can it be general based on 200%?
Yeah, this one, that's a good question, and I think this really drops back to the 200%, because this isn't about a high percentage low income. What you're looking at, so say for example that you have a route, and this is the number of households that have, low-income households that have access to transit. That's a simple numerical value. Elsewhere is where you would determine whether that numerical value represents a high percentage of low-income households in a community. And that is reflected in the criteria section, which we'll get to in a minute.
Last one, from Angie Jones, are percentages from Remix acceptable since Remix does not give exact household numbers?
Ooh, good question. I don't know the answer to that. We'll write that one down. I need to talk to people who are smarter than me about this one. Is that it for questions for now? Okay. And Frank, or somebody that knows Remix better than I, if you have an answer to that, feel free to type it to Seth. Okay. Okay, and then we get into the allocation of STIF funds by project. So actually I whizzed right past add a task, which I do want to add a task because I want to do a capital example. So let's say we're buying buses. So here's the various activity types for your potential buses. We're going to buy an expansion bus. Well, what kind of expansion bus are we buying? I'm going to buy an inner city bus. Okay, so, oh no, I don't want to buy an inner city bus. I want to buy a 30-foot bus. Okay, so we can still change that. All of that works fine. But then we realized, no, it's not an expansion. It is a replacement bus. Okay, so we're still good there. All of this updates to exactly what we need for drop downs. But then what if we decide that, oh no, this is really more about, I'm just making stuff up, people, the bus lines and transitways. So this is where we run into problems, because it will not, if you change your task category, it will not auto update your activity types and your activity details. And then you have a mess. So how to fix that is you select the X in front of the task category, and it basically blows up what you just did, and you start over. Oh, dang it, I hit the wrong button. Ah! Oh, nope, that was right, I'm sorry. Okay, so we'll go back here then. So bus rolling stock, by expansion, pick your bus type. We're gonna buy a 30-footer. And then this is where you enter the quantity, the make, model, length, seats, and fuel type. Fuel type is a drop-down menu. And we are collecting specific information on fuel types. The legislation oddly specifies only 2 low-no fuel types that the legislature is interested in. We think it's useful to know about all of those low-no fuel types. So that's why we've asked it in this particular way. Okay, so I'm going to whiz past that now because I've kind of given those 2, the operations and the capital examples. Everything else is basically a variation on that. And then we get into the criteria. So keeping in mind that the criteria is at a project level of detail. So you're considering the criteria for all of your tasks within the project and the budget that is associated with each particular task. So part of what because I didn't enter dummy numbers for the budget, it didn't auto-populate here, but it will auto-populate, so you'll see your total budget for the project by each year. So as you're considering the criterion, you have that information available to you. So you cannot exceed 100% per criterion per fiscal year, but you can exceed 100% across all of your, or down all of your criteria for fiscal year, per fiscal year. And the reason for that is that you could have projects that 100% of your budget it fits into multiple categories, and I'm not explaining this very well. So you could have a project that has a low-no vehicle, plus you're increasing the frequency of service, plus you're expanding the routes. So what we ask you to do is to make your best guess estimate as to what percentage of your allocation is going to hit that criteria. So if you're improving frequency, for example, in the example that I just gave, you could enter 100% for that year. You could enter 100% here. Criteria 3, no, we're not reducing fares with this particular project, but we are buying a vehicle. And we're going to say 0, 0, and we said no, that we're not serving low-income students with this project. But for example, if you had a high school on the route, that would be a yes if it's an expansion to a new area, or you're increasing the frequency, so you could enter 100% there. So you'll see at the bottom it totals 300%. How we'll be used, frankly, that's not meaningful at all, but how we'll be using this data then is we'll be able to look at percentage of allocation that addresses each of the criterion. And so that is information that will be reported to the legislature. This is one that we looked at very closely in terms of how to do this reporting and how to collect this data, which is part of why we're collecting outcome measures in different ways. There's the percentage of allocation information that we're required to collect, but then there's also data that we think is probably more equally meaningful, which is, things like number of new rides and miles of service, et cetera.
We have a couple of questions.
Okay. It better not be from Teresa.
So first, Scott Chancey just wanted to offer that he believes the percentages from Remix are by census block and are by household.
Okay.
So So thank you, Scott.
I thought that was true as well, but I didn't know that for a fact, so.
Okay. And from Tom Mills, if my project is increasing the frequency on 5 bus lines, I would have one task focused on the operations cost and one task focused on the capital cost for the same project. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's one way you could do it.
Okay. And from Jeff Hazen, how can we fill in make and model of bus if we haven't gone out for requests for qualifications yet?
Well, that is an excellent question. Jeff, I would say give it your best estimate. That's not something we're gonna hold you to. So it's what you think you're gonna do, and then when you actually are doing your reporting on what you actually did, that's how that gets reconciled.
Then Frank Thomas followed up on Remix, and he says that he believes Remix outputs are sufficient for very rural qualified entity jurisdictions, but he can follow up to provide more information.
Okay.
And that's all.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. Good questions also. Okay, and then for each project, identifying which Oregon Public Transportation goals and policies that your project is consistent with. We auto-populated this and put them in here as checkboxes to save you the pain and agony, because I have had to do this when I was doing land use development permitting work, from having to actually go and look this up and write narrative. So this is the draft goal and policy language from the OPTP, which should be adopted next month. So we're being a little anticipatory here. So, and you need to select at least one goal. There could be multiple. So if you're going to select, say, equity, that will generate a drop down, and then you can select the equity policies that are also supported by your project. For each goal that you select, the drop down for the related policies also appears. Okay, I feel like I should have done some auto-populating up here with funding. $500. Who's going to do that? I don't know. I'm also going to go back. Bear with me, folks. Where's my school's question?
It's below.
It's below? Did I go too far?
Yeah.
Where is it?
It's in the, right there.
I'm going to switch this. So I should have shown you this earlier. If you select yes, that it's supporting student transportation, we auto-populated with a number of different operations options. So you select at least one of these. If none of these is relevant to your project, so whichever one you select, a drop-down appears, and then you have an opportunity to enter the number that's associated with that. If you select other, because none of those are relevant, you enter what the measure is and then the number of units. So when we then roll back down to the project, I'll pause here. So that's what just happened.
Oh, I think you're still on screen, but for some reason your projector's asleep.
Okay, just a second, we're having some issues. Okay, I'm back. Okay, my screen went blank there for a moment. Sorry, folks. And then I panicked and started slapping Seth's arm. Help me, help me. Okay, so this is right above the criteria section. So then you see those budget numbers auto-populated. Okay. So we're going back down then to the project summary. Okay, so based on percentages that we entered above, it auto-populated the amount that's in district, the amount that's out of district, your project grand total, and then your total by fiscal year, and then your percentages for student transport. But that didn't update.
Because you have 0 on all those. You have to put a.
Because I have 0 where?
Go back up to the. Right there. You have to put a percentage in there.
Ah, okay. See, this is why Brian's here. He's so much smarter than me. So we're going to say 50% was for student transport. There we go. So that auto-populated there. So that's your first project. So just by going through this example, you can see how this could be a pretty time-consuming activity. So please give yourself plenty of time to enter this data. And then you could enter another project. We're not going to enter another project today because we're at an hour already. And then we get into the whole plan summary. So this is all of your projects entered and summarized. So then this is where we look at and we're like, wow, you hit only 50% of funds supporting student transit. So explain why you didn't do that. So this is where, if you think it's not practicable, you would have to tell us why it's not practicable to hit the 1% per year. Okay, and so then we get to the signature page. So as you might recall, your STIF plan also serves in effect as a legally binding agreement between the QE and the state of Oregon. There is no separate grant agreement that is needed, which is why you need to have someone who has signing authority sign the signature page. So you select the hyperlink, which takes you to the signature page. This is editable. I'm looking at Brian.
It's PDF. So.
It's a PDF. Okay. Okay. So you're basically printing it and completing it. And then here's all of the things that you're agreeing to. The other piece to this to keep in mind is that when you sign it, you're saying you're going to follow the statute, you're going to follow the OARs, etc. So you sign that and then scan it and then upload the signature page here. And then when you've got it entirely completed, you hit submit to submit your plan, and then you get a copy of it emailed to you. So maybe some questions. Brian, what happens if somebody submits a plan, but then they want to edit it? How do they do that?
You should be able to access that from your initial submission, and if you hit save, a window will pop up there and prompt you to enter your email, and there should be a link there. And if you can't find the email, you can actually contact Karen, and Karen will let me know, and I can send that to you as well. Okay. So they can continue to basically overwrite over whatever they've submitted, resave it, and resubmit it? Yes, until the cutoff date. Until the cutoff date. Okay. Okay, so that is the short and dirty version on, I don't know if it was dirty, but a fast and dirty, I don't know, on how to complete your STIF plan template. Again, I just remind folks that there's a lot of extra content in the guidance document and guidance around some of the details on how to do this. And as always, your RTCs are a great resource.
We do have one question.
Okay.
From Tom Mills. What if a qualified entity is using 1% of funds to create a program where schools apply to subsidize student fares? Can we just use an estimate based on the amount of funds available and the cost of the fare?
Yes. I think that's a great solution. Okay. The other thing I wanted to do real quickly is just go to our website to just give you an idea where to find some additional resources. So on the website about the STIF components, there's a Formula Fund section where we have hyperlinks to the solicitation notice of materials, the schedule. There's a process graphic, map of qualified entities, the Formula Fund allocation estimates, and the Formula Fund, their sub-allocation guidance. Related to the rules, in particular, we have the rules webinar recording that was done in July, the PowerPoint from that, as well as responses to the questions that were asked during that webinar. Y'all had a lot of questions. That's like a 10-page document. So that is located there. Once you go to the solicitation notice of materials link, that takes you to the funding opportunities page, and it's the very first one at the top. And within this link, you'll also find the actual documents for the Formula Fund guidance and application instructions. And then down at the bottom, there is some additional resources. This is where you find the optional public transportation service provider project application template. We have also developed a public engagement guidance document or primer to help providers with doing their public engagement. Some of the legal requirements are in there, as well as links to additional resources and some best practices information. We have an advisory committee bylaws template that's available for qualified entities as well, and then some other links. So I just wanted to point that out to folks if you hadn't already been aware of where to find some of these resources. Okay, and I think with that, I will open it up to general questions if you have any about the Formula Fund, the process, the rules, etc.
I did want to check in with Paula Quinn. She's been using the raised hand feature, which we didn't talk about, and I'm not sure if that was at the very beginning before the webinar started. I just want to see if Paula had a question or not, and if you do, please type that into the chat.
So we're not seeing any questions, and we'll be wrapping up early today, folks.
Will we be posting questions from this webinar?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think the only sort of follow-up is, remind me who asked the remix household question. That was an Angie?
Yes. Angie Jones.
Angie Jones. So Angie, I think Frank is your RTC if I recall, so Frank will follow up directly with you. How about that?
And we have recorded this webinar.
Yes. So the webinar is recorded. We'll post it on our website within the next week or so.
Angie says thank you.
Okay, well, if there are no questions, we will wrap it up today. Thank you, everyone, for participating. I hope you found it to be helpful and useful, and you know where to find us as you start to work on completing your plan and if you have questions.
We just got one question from Tom Mills.
Tom, hello, Tom.
We have a local plan for increased service, but not for student fares or electric bus expansion, though we're working on a policy. Do we need to develop plans for those items?
Okay, let me see it.
We have.
The question is, do you need a local plan for those? So part of the local plan definition includes policies that reference the work that you're doing. So for example, if you have an adopted policy that supports providing reduced student fares, then that would suffice to meet the local plan definition as part of your larger body of plans. But you do need to have an adopted policy if you don't have that provided for in a local plan, any other local plan it is. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to say goodbye and thank you so much for joining us today, and good luck with your continuing work on your plans. We're looking forward to receiving those applications and seeing, most importantly, those service enhancements happening across Oregon. It's a really exciting time. Thanks, everyone.